Rajat Kathuria ji, Madan Sabnavis ji, he is not here with us, but he'll be joining online. Rajan Katoch ji in conversation with Raghav Chandra ji. India is one of the fastest growing major economies and is currently We are beginning with India's $5 trillion economy, what it takes. India is one of the fastest growing major economies and is currently ranked as the world's sixth largest economy. Projections of growth over the medium term remain encouraging and optimistic for India. The underlying strengths are indicative of the potential of India to achieve a US 5 trillion economy by 2025. The current structure of the economy and the emerging dynamics provide us grounds to target achieving $1 trillion from agriculture and allied activities, $1 trillion from manufacturing, and $3 trillion from services. To give us a better understanding on India's $5 trillion economy, what it takes, we have with us our first speaker for the session, Rajat Kathuria ji. He is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Professor of Economics at Shiv Nadar Institution of Eminence. He is the former Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economics Relations. He worked with the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India during its initial years. He is currently the co-chair of the T20 Digital Task Force under India's G20 presidency. Our second speaker, Madan Sabnavis ji, who will be joining with us online, he has been working with the Bank of Baroda as chief economist since 2022. Prior to this assignment, was chief economist with Care Ratings for 12 years. He has been working for 26 years as a corporate economist in organizations like ICICI Limited, ICICI Bank, L&T, and NCDEX. He is a postgraduate in economics from Delhi School of Economics after graduating in economics from St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. He is also the author of over 3,000 articles in newspapers, including Mint, Financial Express, Business Line, Business Standard, and he has also authored 7 books. Accompanying them, we have Dr. Rajan Katoch. He is an IS and is a former Secretary of Heavy Industry, Government of India. In course of a distinguished civil service career, he has served in the Finance and Commerce Ministries and on deputation to the World Bank. A student of economics, he writes regularly on topical economic issues. He will be in conversation with Mr. Raghav Chandra. He is the president of the Society for Culture and Environment and the director of Bhopal Literature and Art Festival. From the IAS, he has been Secretary Government of India and before that, Chairman National Highways Authority of India. He has written extensively on management and infrastructure issues. He is the author of the novels Scent of a Game, Rupa, Kali's Daughter, and has edited the book Eternal Wisdom of the Tribes. He is on the managing committee of the Delhi Golf Club and writes a column for Business World magazine. We are honored to have you all here. Let's have a huge round of applause for our panelists. May I please request Raghav Chandra ji to unfold the conversation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hi Rajat, hi sir, Rajan Katoch Saab, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. They say that money makes the mayor go round. And nothing really moves without money. The economy is as important as anything else. In fact, perhaps the most important instrument of development. And we're going to be talking about it. There are lots of discussions, lots and lots of articles on how soon India is going to achieve the $5 trillion economy golden mark, and how that is going to position us in that sweet spot where we will practically rule the world. But before we start discussing about the entire concept of how fast we are getting there, at what speed we are going, what are the bumps on the road, whether we will get there, and so on, I want to ask Mr. Rajan Katoch a preliminary question, and in fact, both the panelists here and Madan, how appropriate is it to be even talking of achieving a $5 trillion economy? How relevant is it for the entire gamut of discussions around the health and of the Indian economy and where we are going in the years to come? Mr. Rajan Katoch.
Thank you, Raghav, Rajat, and Madan, and everyone here. This, question of $5 trillion economy, it's a buzzword we've been hearing for some last few years. It has at least, to my mind, 3 dimensions. The first, most obviously, the international one. But, one might think that how do you measure the progress of a country? Till now, and the economics that when I learned in college and then in government, we used to talk about rates of growth. So, you're growing at 5%, 6%, 7%, 6, 7, that's good. So why are we suddenly talking about $5 trillion economy? So one, way in this of thinking is, rates of growth tell you how well you are doing as an economy. You might say, okay, we are at 7%, which is terrific. But Senegal is at 9%, Maldives is, I think last year was 13%. So what we are trying to do now is, when you say $5 trillion economy, you're saying what's our place in the world? And then, the size of the economy is important. At 5 trillion, as in when you get there, right now we are at around the 5th largest, with Japan and Germany at, above us. We are at 3.5, they're at 4. But our rate of growth is such that by the time you get to 5, you'll be the 3rd largest. So you're sending out a signal to the world that, this is where we are. The interesting thing also to note is we are talking about the dollar economy. That means we are marking it against a market benchmark. We are not talking about, purchasing power parity, that PPP concept and all, which, frankly, is a little sort of condescending, because, that tries to show developing countries that you're doing better than you are. So that's the, international dimension. And obviously, when you start projecting repeatedly again and again over the years that we are amongst the largest, it has implications on foreign investment, on the way outside world sees us. Even, I dare say, in the confidence by which we engage in, economic diplomacy, for example. So that's, one aspect of this whole thing. Second dimension is domestic. In domestic, it's basically the leadership setting out a vision, and a vision which is not business as usual. You might argue that, what difference does it make to the man on the street that $5 trillion economy, very abstract sort of concept. I would have also been inclined to that, except that I've heard firsthand at a, sort of tea stall in a Mufassil town, a fairly heated debate on the subject by one gentleman who says, "Saab, hum log $5 trillion economy banne wale hain," and the other guy saying, "To usme kya farak padta hai?" Regardless of where the debate went, but the point is the awareness is there. The awareness is that yes, something's going to happen. Our significance in the world is going to increase. So that's one dimension. And the third is within the system. I mean, being a part of the system, you realize the importance of these markers. I've been in the planning commission also in the Vajpayee days, and where some grand targets were set out. So once you put in this target and you say 5 years, it doesn't really matter where 2018 mein tha, and you'll say ki 2023 it should be done, or 2024. Today, I think the finance minister is saying 27, 28. It will happen. But what's more important is the system starts gearing up to it. So every wing of government will start seeing that, okay, is the way we are moving, will it get us to my part in this 5 trillion? Or is there some reforms needed? Maybe some more, new initiatives, priorities. If there are priorities, how are they going to be funded? Government outlays, private sector, PPP. So, the whole machinery starts churning and starts moving in that direction. That is and the leadership will also be asking whenever they have reviews, okay, what you've done, how is it taking us here?
True.
So I think these are the 3 dimensions, why it's not just a random, catchphrase or a target which is thrown about that, 5 trillion sounds very cool and all.
So I'll take it to Madan. Madan, you're in Mumbai, and thank you very much for joining us virtually. And because of the paucity of time, we couldn't get you here. Madan, would you like to talk about the relevance of the $5 trillion figure? And is it just a statistic, or does it have any larger implication for India's FDI, economic growth in the larger way, social development and other issues?
Thanks a lot, Raghav, for having me here. It's indeed a privilege to be here. And though I'm coming online, I think I can appreciate the sense out there. Now, I think this is a very important issue which has been flagged of 5 trillion, because we have had conferences here in Mumbai where you also talk of 7 trillion economy. We've heard of conferences having 10 trillion economy. That actually makes us actually sit back and think, what exactly are we talking about? Now, we should remember in economics, we have something called a real GDP and we have something called nominal GDP. And what we are referring to actually is the nominal GDP. So when I say a 5 trillion economy, it is basically a real GDP plus inflation, which gives me a nominal GDP. So this 5 trillion mark is actually a kind of an aspiration. I think it's always good to have an aspiration, because that's when we are able to target our policies and accordingly formulate things around us. But we should remember in the last couple of years, we've actually had nominal GDP grow at over 15% per annum. But my real GDP growth was much lower. What does this mean? That I can get this 5 trillion economy number by just having higher inflation. So it could be kind of a misnomer that way. So that's why we as economists normally tend to be harping more on real GDP. And as was mentioned earlier by the panelists, I think real GDP growth is something which really matters. But this said, it's always good to have, as I said, as a matter of aspiration, that we're looking at a number of 5 trillion economy, because one can actually sit back and say that every economy can target a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending upon where you are. And at some point of time, you may be able to achieve it. But I think the crux is that we need to really focus on the real GDP growth. The nominal will happen in normal course. Now, just look at the year 23-24. We've really had low GDP growth. If you look at the budget, we spoke of 10.5% growth in GDP. The CSO now says that we're growing at, say, 8.7 or 8.9, which means that our entire target achievement is going to get deferred in case we keep having progressively lower inflation, even though our real GDP growth will be in this region of 7.5%. So I think that we should look at this GDP growth, this number in this particular context. And I think more important, actually, when we're talking of GDP, is the quality of GDP. One is whether it's being caused by inflation or whether it's being caused by real GDP. Second is, what is the overall quality of growth which we are seeing? I think that is where I think we've already seen that the government has had very progressive plans to actually look at social welfare. You really go down to the grassroots. Now, look at this kind of a situation we have where the government has promised 800 million people free food for the next 5 years. So one thing is to say it's a very positive measure because this is something which is required. The second part, it also is a reflection of the fact that I have 800 million people who are still dependent upon the government to get their food. Lots of the social welfare
Madan,
schemes.
we'll come more deep into those things,
Okay.
but let me just get a preliminary sense of the subject from Rajat also. And both of you are hardcore serving economists, so it'll be good to have his perspective also before we go deep into the subject. Rajat.
Thanks, Raghav. I sort of agree with Rajan and Madan, both in the sense that this is aspirational. The $5 trillion target is very, very aspirational. And not repeating what both of them have said, let me just add, I mean, we will get there. There is no question about it. Madan said, if we have only inflation and no growth, if a car is produced tomorrow at double the price, then we've doubled nominal GDP in a sense. So, you know, we will get there. In PPP terms, we are already the third largest economy in the world. China is the largest economy in the world in PPP terms already. So, you know, depending on how you are sort of skinning the cat, you can, a number is a number. I mean, you know, as Mark Twain said, number can be. But let me sort of reiterate what Rajan is saying. He said it abstracts from distribution, this $5 trillion number. And sort of Madan just mentioned that you have distributional issues, but $5 trillion abstracts from all of that and gives us a sense of well-being, of the fact that we are doing well, and maybe, you know, incites the animal spirits in the stock market. Certainly, I think the animal spirits get affected by $5 trillion. But, you know, it could also have a negative. And, you know, my experience, let's say, in the telecom regulatory authority I was just mentioned, when I was in telecom, there was this number that was thrown out that the auction of the spectrum has resulted, or lack of auction of the spectrum, has resulted in a 1.76 lakh crore loss to the exchequer. Myth or reality, this became sort of where everybody, you know, anybody talking about telecom, everybody started talking about this figure. It was internalized by people who were related or not related to the telecom sector. And if you disaggregated the numbers and you did, you know, there were so many assumptions embedded in that number that it was hard put to replicate that number by a different. So if you get two economists, you'll get three numbers. So the 5 trillion economy, so it's a positive sort of aspiration, that 1.76, of course, reflecting a negative aspiration, but both are doing the same thing. They're sort of talking up the economy, and eventually, as I said, we will get there. And it's good to abstract from things once in a while.
Great. So let me start off on a positive note, that at a time when the world economy seems to be going through tepid growth, China is viewed as an economy in transition from a very, very robust growth some years ago. And the Indian economy is still managing to project growth of anything between 7 to 8%. Let's get to some of the key macroeconomic fundamentals. Madan, I'll start with you, and because you're located in Mumbai, what, according to you, are the key macroeconomic fundamentals in the monetary policy side relating to what the Reserve Bank is doing, the impact on the stock market, and so on, and how does that speak about the basic strength and fundamentals of our economy?
Okay, now if you're looking at monetary policy and what the RBI has been doing, I think it has been a very, very proactive, very, very positive kind of a position which has been taken by the RBI right from the time of COVID. So during COVID, what did we do? We actually made sure a lot of liquidity was available to all the sectors which required it. We also saw the repo rate coming down to 4%. And the critical part is that while other countries, if you look at US, you look at the entire European region, you also look at, say, China, how do we actually roll back this liquidity or this openness which was done by the central bank? So I think the way in which the RBI has done it, it has been done in a very non-obtrusive manner. So we have seen the movement back from 4% to 6.5% without really coming in the way of growth. And today we have this kind of an anomaly in the situation that even though the RBI has increased the repo rate, we have not really seen a major slowdown in credit. In fact, growth in credit continues. So conventional economic policy, economic theory would have said that how does monetary policy work? You increase the rates, you're able to cut down the growth in credit. Accordingly, you're able to lower demand and you're able to bring down inflation. But the way in which the RBI has managed, it's primarily because of the fact that what they have done is a correction. Whereas when I look at the Federal Reserve, when you get their Fed rate to say 5.5%, that is an unusual number. So as you keep lowering the rate down to your 2%, which is supposed to be the ideal rate, we will see a lot of pain in the US economy. So that's one of the reasons. See, what you mentioned earlier, that but why is it that India is different? I think because of the way in which we handled COVID, the way we have come out of it, and even if you look at what the government has done, there's not been excessive spending. Maybe at that point of time, quite a few of us were critical, saying that the government is doing everything through the RBI. We have not seen any free cash being given to people, which was done in the Western countries. But actually, there was a lot of prudence shown in retrospect. So today, when we see getting fiscal discipline, getting monetary policy in place in a non-oppressive manner, making sure that we don't really come in the way of growth, I think that has been the positive achievement. And just the last point out here, when you say, why is it India is different, we should also remember that we are basically a domestic-oriented economy. So while we are talking of getting into global supply chains, we are talking in terms of stronger linkages. I think there's a bit of decoupling which is there. We are not an exporter-oriented economy. Exports help us to add to a balance of payments on the external account, but inherent growth comes from within the economy, and that's the reason why we're performing better than the other nations.
And Rajat, what would you say have been the factors in our fiscal policy? Because we have managed to control our fiscal deficit quite efficiently. The budget is round the corner, even though it's a vote on account. What specific steps do you think the fiscal policy has determined which have helped our economy to stay on an even keel, as a result of which we are doing well?
So the government's fiscal policy has been guided by trying to get the fiscal deficit down to about 3%. That's an aspiration, but that number keeps getting pushed down the road because we had COVID, we had the global financial crisis. So that number keeps getting pushed down the road. So on the expenditure side of the government's sort of balance sheet, there are some things that the government does and very little degrees of freedom on the expenditure side because the government, after COVID, after the financial crisis, government got into the economy, as Madan is saying, there was fiscal stimulus, so they invested. So there's a lot of public sector investment that is happening either directly or through the private public route. So the government has been, in times of crisis, of course, the government comes in and spends. So what I'm saying on the expenditure side, the government can do a little bit of reallocation. Given COVID, you've also had a lot of transfers that have happened. Narega the expenditure on Narega has been very high also. So subsidies, which form about 2.5% of GDP, those have remained where they are. So I think the reason why the government has been able to sort of keep the fiscal deficit, it hasn't gone out of proportion. As Madan was saying, nominal inflation also helped keep the, inflation also helped keep the deficit low. This year will be a worry because inflation, as Madan is saying, we factored in 10.5% and growth is going to come in at 8.9 or 9%. So there'll be a little bit of hit to the fiscal deficit target this year, what was anticipated in last year's budget. But on the positive side, I think there are a couple of developments that there is increasing formalization in the Indian economy. GST has enabled increasing formalization in the Indian economy. So although GST had an impact on the very, very small, the micro enterprises, India's, amongst the small and medium enterprises, 99.4% are the very, very micro enterprises, very, very small. So GST had an adverse impact on them, on some of them, but GST also helped formalize the system, and therefore tax receipts of the government, with the income growing, direct tax receipts have also gone up. So I think where India can make an impact and where this government has been trying to make an impact is, as I said, the degrees of freedom on expenditure side being very limited. There's some reallocation of expenditure between capital and consumption. But on the revenue side, on both on the direct taxes, indirect taxes, and some amount of disinvestment, the government has been able to keep, as you are saying, on an even keel. Although it will be some time, I think, that we reach our aspirational target of 3%. That was set out by Finance Minister Jaswant Singh, I think, FRBM, I remember. Madan, you might remember. There's long ago that we need to get our fiscal deficit to 3% and our revenue deficit to 0. Now, revenue deficit is government borrowing to spend on salaries, on subsidies, get that down to zero, and then whatever you expand should be in terms of capital. So what Mr. Jaswant Singh, the phrase that he used very interestingly was, let us expand the fiscal deficit productively. That means revenue deficit comes to zero, and whatever the government spends extra, it is in terms of investments that can get the government return, either return in money or returns in social terms. Yeah.
So I'll continue with you, Rajat, and now I'm coming to the deeper end and more difficult issues on reasons why the economy may not really be as sound as it seems. And we are looking at not just the economy as a balance sheet, but the economy as it will be in the long run. The unemployment rate is reputed to be about 6%, 6.1 to be precise. Amongst the graduates and postgraduates, the unemployment rate is as high as 35%. The India Skills Report says that half of the graduates are unemployable. There's a proliferation of colleges, which actually means that colleges are growing, numbers, getting education is high, but the quality of education is not really commensurate with the number of people going in. And the employment in the manufacturing sector versus that in the agriculture sector is being reversed. And a lot of economists have written about that, and perhaps you would know more about it. So please tell us whether that is really truthful or whether that is just a lot of bogey beating.
No. There's no smoke without fire, I think. This is sort of complex and complicated question. I'm sure if you put 2-3 economists in the room, you'll get multiple opinions. But let me lay out what I think. We are certainly not in a healthy or a happy situation as far as the economy is concerned, notwithstanding the high growth rates. And the reason is that, Madan pointed to one of the reasons, which is 800 million people still require, we are a country of 1.4 billion people, a labor force, which is about 50% of 1.4 billion, out of which 6.5 or maybe 7% unemployed, out of which women's participation rate is at an all-time low, right? And these numbers are not, make-believe numbers. Also, the fact that employment, I think, is a ticking time bomb for us. And I'm using the word carefully because we haven't been able to create productive jobs in the manufacturing sector like China was able to do. And there's this ongoing debate in India, which is endless. Raghu has just come out with a book, Rajan, with Rohit Lamba, saying that breaking the mold, manufacturing is not going to do to us what it did to China, i.e., it is not going to help in taking off for India, which means employment in manufacturing is unlikely to happen. Now you juxtapose that argument with the fact that service sector in India is not competitive, and I might sound like a heretic here. The services sector, IT is competitive, but IT is only one among many services sectors in India. Banking, insurance, business services. IT services is one sector which we are competitive in. And we are not competitive in all services sectors, right? So IT being able to provide employment to the burgeoning labor force with the skill levels that Raghav is talking about, I don't think that's going to be an answer. PLI, very good, etc. The other, if you juxtapose this with the fact that what is our abundant factor? Permit me to lose a little bit of jargon. Our abundant factor is labor, relatively less skilled and relatively less educated. It's a fact. I'm not sort of trying to be, display any sort of value here. It's just as it is. You've seen the ASAR reports, I guess, that come out from Pratham. So our abundant factor is labor, which is less educated and less skilled. Now, if you juxtapose this with the kind of opportunities that these people can get, and how has it been done in the past? Korea, China, Japan, Europe, China, every country before us has used the manufacturing sector for the takeoff. Labor-intensive manufacturing sector has been the sector that has resulted in a takeoff. It's not been the services sector, which is why Raghuram Rajan is calling breaking the mold, breaking the empirical evidence that is before us. Now, I don't know whether, I hope it happens, but the kind of services that you you talk to people. Do you want to sell tea? Do you want to sell, on the roadside? Do you want to create these small entrepreneur pockets, which you see all over the country? Is that the kind of service sector job that you want, or do you want a more sort of productive service sector job? They'll tell you we're doing this because we don't have an option. Nobody in India, the unemployment rate is 6%, 6.5%, because people can't afford to be unemployment. They have to do something so that they can make ends meet. So it's jobs is, the point I'm trying to make is jobs is a crisis. We've heard of jobless growth. Planning Commission, just before it wound up, it said we need 100 million jobs, 10 million jobs a year for the next 10 years to be able to sort of accommodate this growing labor force. I don't know where the answer is, whether it's services or manufacturing or a combination of the two. But this is a sort of a scary situation. If you ask me for my view, I think it's still, not opposing, Raghu is not saying that manufacturing is, but I think for us, people are not going to stop wearing shirts and shoes and ties and, you'll still, demand for toys will still be there. And I don't think they'll be automated out of existence. So I think manufacturing sector, there is something to say about labor-intensive manufacturing.
Yeah. So Madan, I'll ask you whether the Indian industry's investment in new enterprises is commensurate with the quality and with the pace, the quantum of growth that we expect. The savings rate has not increased in India. The investment rate has, in fact, they say, fallen to 29% in this decade between 2010 and 2020. And as Rajat pointed out, the share of manufacturing has not increased. We're still at about 17% compared to about 25 or 26% of our neighbor larger economy, and the agrarian labor force is increasing. So what's your take on domestic private industry? While a lot of FDI is coming into India, and we say that we have some very large, significant FDI figures every year, what about Indian industry? Why is it not investing adequately? And where is it holding up its money, and why is it holding it up?
So I think this is a very interesting question, because this was a question which could have been raised also in 2018-19, that is before the pandemic. And once we had the pandemic, of course, we went down, and now we're in a case of trying to get our act together. The basic problem with investment is, with private sector investment, is that there is absence of demand. So that's actually break up investment. See, there is investment which takes place broadly in the consumer sphere, it takes place in the infrastructure sphere. And then the third part which we can talk of is the so-called startups, all those ventures. We have been talking a lot about them. So if I look at investment in, say, the infrastructure sphere, that is, if I look at industries like cement, steel, maybe to a certain extent chemicals, which are also related to it, we have seen that investment is still taking place. The reason being that we have good capacity utilization rates. Ideally, in Indian industry, we have seen that if you cross the level of 80% capacity utilization, then there is an incentive for you to invest more in capital, because you need to produce more goods. So that's one of the reasons why you go ahead for it. Even if you're in services, for example, the hospitality industry, in case you see that there's full occupancy most of the time, or near full occupancy, then you go in for expansion, depending upon the environment. That is in terms of services. However, if you look at the consumer goods industries, we have seen there's been very limited investment. And this is something which we keep tracking regularly about the corporate discourses, their investor presentations, what is it that these companies are saying. So if you look at all the FMCG companies, the durable companies which are there, the consumer durable goods, all of them say that we're having a problem in terms of demand. Very often you point out saying it is rural demand which is absent. Premium products are doing well. So that is a problem of inequality which we have. Rich are, of course, spending a lot, but the poor are not in a position to spend. And why is this the case? I think what Rajat was talking of, the earlier question, is the case of employment. Today we're creating employment in low value jobs, construction, We're getting them in your Zomato and Swiggy people who are moving around, working for 12, 14 hours a day. An interesting thing is when I speak to these Zomato guys in 2018, 19, they say they were getting 45 rupees per order. Today they need to do something like 30 or 40 orders to get something like 1,200 rupees a day. So they start working from 6 o'clock in the morning, they're right up to midnight, and on an works out to 20, 25 rupees. So obviously with 20, 25 rupees per order, you will not be able to have that kind of consumption. And that's one of the reasons as to why we have seen that capacity utilization rates are still lagging. RBI gives a certain information on overall capacity utilization. By the time we come to March, it comes towards 74, 75, and again it drops to 73%. But we actually should be looking at a number of around 80%. So I think job creation creates demand. Once there is demand, there is consumption. Once there's consumption, there's automatically more investment taking place. So today when we keep harping on saying that the central government is doing the heavy lifting when it comes to capex, the reason is because the private sector always looks on return on investment. So if I'm going to put 100 rupees, if I'm going to borrow 100 rupees, put in machinery, I need to get a return of X%. The government doesn't have to think of it, therefore they're increasing the capex. If you look at the state governments, for example, they always seem to be falling short of it. Why? Because the FRBM holds more for states than the center. Today, if the center doesn't touch 6%, they go to 7%, nothing really happens. Some of the economists will complain, writing columns in newspapers, but nothing stops them. Whereas states, if you say it's 3.5% fiscal deficit or 4% or 3.25, you cannot breach it. And what do the states do? I'm not able to do it because conditions are not favorable. I don't get enough revenue. I need to spend on subsidies and other things. Then I cut back on capital expenditure. Overall, your investment rate falls. So what you're saying is right. We had around 34% gross fixed capital formation rate. We came down to 26. Now we're coming down to 29. So things are happening, albeit very, very slowly, gradually. Private sector is always looking also at profits, so that's the reason why things are going to move slowly. So the crux actually is that we need to create jobs. Where do we create it? Is it manufacturing? Today, actually, when you talk of AI coming into the picture, should companies actually be having more labor, or you have used technology to do what labor can do? I think it's a very, very scary proposition in a labor surplus country like India, but then that's what the reality is.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Rajan Katoch, you know, the IT sector is one sector which is a very truly a success story for India. And while we may be not so happy about where our manufacturing is going, but the IT sector in terms of our service sector is something which is really looking up and for various reasons, including the digital stack, the DPI, the Aadhaar, the JAM Trinity, and so on. And as a result of which, we are amongst the second largest consumers of data in the world. Our IT industry is projected to grow to about $1 trillion in a couple of years. And thanks to that, because ultimately IT does affect everything across the board. The stock market has been doing very well. I mean, it's a positive story. The Nifty has, is projected to go up from 22,000 to almost 25,000. The Sensex is already at a crazy figure of 70,000, expected to go up to 74,000 in the next 1 year. And, the economy, the internet economy, as I mentioned, is expected to go up to $1 trillion. And our UPI's transactions in 1 year are about 130 billion, making us the cynosure of all global eyes. So do you also feel like, like the two fellow economists, that something radical needs to be done on our industrial front in terms of industrial policies, in terms of our exports, to ramp up things to make the economy more sustainable in the long run?
I think both Rajat and Madan have already hit upon the issues. One, I'd just like to take off on something which Rajat mentioned about the jobs. If you just go a bit deeper, one is that, okay, there aren't enough jobs. Second is, at least that's been my experience, if you speak to people who are private sector employers, especially in the manufacturing sector, also in the IT sector, you'll find that they have a tough time in hiring capable people. That means somebody who's qualified but not actually fit for the job. And many of them spend a lot of internal resources to maybe 6 months training or something to bring them up to the level that they would like to be. So behind this crisis of employment is also a crisis of education. In fact, and particularly on the technical side, you're not creating people with the kind of skill set which are needed at this point of time. So I think that's one drag which also applies to IT, but more so I think in manufacturing. In a sense, you talked about the successes of IT and digitalization. In the most recent speech, I think, of the finance minister in Vibrant Gujarat, when she talked about 5 trillion, she also compartmentalized it as 1 trillion agriculture, 1 trillion manufacturing, and 3 trillion services, in a way acknowledging implicitly that, yeah, that's going to have to do the heavy lifting. Whether it's possible or not, I don't know. But, but there's a deeper crisis which probably has to be addressed with the same kind of urgency as we are trying to do directly by just, capex spending and things like that.
Great. So, no discussion is complete without a comparison of the Indian economy with that of the Chinese economy. And if we have to move, as we said, that $5 trillion can be a mere statistic until and unless we benchmark it against other parameters. And one of them, of course, is the per capita income parameter, because you can be the 5th largest economy, but until and unless your per capita income is also substantial, you could still be pretty weak as an economy. So we have a set of economists here, and I'm going to read out some stats, and I want you all to react to them because, while India's overall economy is worth $3.4 trillion, China's is 4.5 times that of ours, is $18 trillion. India's share of the global GDP is 3.3%. China's is 18.4%. The number of demat accounts that we have in India covers 5.6% of our population is mapped by demat accounts, whereas in the case of China, it's 15%. In the case of the USA, it is 56%. And when it comes to all, the share of global exports, India is 2.4% versus China's 12.4%. And in the agriculture sector, whereas India, the agriculture sector contributes as much as 15%. In the case of China, it contributes only 8%. We get, in terms of tourists, 63 million tourists, foreign tourists. China gets several times more. The labor force participation in China is much more than ours. The female labor force contributing proportion is almost 2.5 times that of ours, and most significantly, the per capita income is almost 4 times or even more than ours. So Rajat, let me begin with you. Is it proper to compare ourselves with China, and should we benchmark against that, or should we just ignore it completely and say that, look, we are doing well, we are different, we have our own unique set of systems, and any comparisons are abhorrible?
No, I don't think we should not compare. We should compare. There's no harm in comparing. I will tell you an anecdote with when I was in ICRIER, the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. We had track 2 dialogue with China. And so Chinese were very impressed with our services sector, and we, of course, wanted to learn manufacturing. So we decided that we would do an exchange of researchers, and our researchers went to China to study manufacturing. Their researchers came here to study our services sector. And then in the end, we had a joint conference, and we sort of presented our papers. And it turned out that, that while our it wasn't the fact that that we were not competitive in services compared to China, we were, but it turned out that in education services, the point that Rajan had made, they were much better than us in terms of all the ratios, gross enrollment ratio, education, tertiary education. So China's sort of road to success has been investment in education. In fact, all of East Asia. And on top of that, they've had manufacturing investment. Now, agriculture, so if you look at the structural transformation, how it's happened in nation, and I'll say this very quickly, US is only 2% of agriculture, only 2%, yet they can feed not only themselves but several other countries because they are a $20 trillion plus economy, so 2% of that, it's a primary product with relatively inelastic demand. So how much of food? So you go to do other items like services which are more luxury in nature. India will also eventually get there. But I think the way our structural transformation has worked out for, I don't know, whatever reason, you may call it labor laws, some people call it bad infrastructure, some people call it political economy, some people call it octroi. There are a whole host of reasons why we actually bypassed the manufacturing stage. So we went from agriculture, and instead of going to industry, which would become more productive and therefore give you a bang for the buck on GDP, we went into low productive services rather than high productive manufacturing. And can we reverse that? I still think we can reverse that. Our manufacturing needs to go up to 25%. Can we hope that services will lead us to the takeoff? I'm sort of really down. How many designers, how many people are you going to be able to accommodate in high-end services? We are aspirational. Apple will come here. PLI will get Micron here. Yes, but how many jobs is that going to create? So the point I'm making is that we should compare ourselves. We should sort of learn from what China did right. And I think one of the other things that China did right was they were able to create scale. Their small companies grew large very quickly, and we did studies which show that it took 25 years for a similar startup in India to reach the scale that China would reach in 5 years. That's the gap in how they reached scale. And scale then gives you a sort of employment opportunity. So number of startups in the services sector in India are doing well, but number of startups in the manufacturing sector in India haven't done as well as China. So I think the answer to the question of what we are going to do in the future is still sort of the old structural transformation, the Lewis model, get people from agriculture. Agriculture will decline, there's no question about it, it'll go down. Whether you take them into services, less productive services, or slightly higher productive manufacturing, that's where I think we need to be able to plan and create policy incentives for that.
Madan, would you like to add to that?
See, I would largely agree with what Rajat has mentioned. And I think some of what he said is what both of us heard in our lectures room in Delhi School of Economics. So I would also reiterate the same thing. But I think when you're doing this comparison with China, I think it may probably not be a fair thing to do. The reason being that all countries are different, initial conditions are different, and more importantly, I think governance structures are different. I think we have been a democratic nation right from the time of independence. Unlike China, where you could actually have a kind of a dictatorial style where you could get in policies when you want to. Think of it in India itself, how long did GST take to come about? Yeah? Because I think all parties opposed it at some point of time, all of them supported at some point of time. But I think this continuous kind of a debate was something which actually led to a very healthy structure which we have today. Similarly, today, everybody talks about reforms in the land reforms, for example. Is it that easy to bring about land reforms? The answer is no. See, one thing is that if you're like China, you can just say that all this land which belongs to you now belongs to me, and I'm going to use it for whatever purpose the state thinks is important. Whereas in India, it's not the same thing which can be done, and I don't think it's a fair thing. In fact, an example I always give in Mumbai is that will people be very happy if I say that Reserve Bank of India building is demolished where it is located? It's located, we transfer it to Dombivli, everything is anyway online, and we do the same thing to Bombay Stock Exchange, National Stock Exchange, everybody goes to the suburbs, and we have your metro sheds to make sure that we have very good transport. The answer is that no, nobody wants to move out from there. Why should a farmer give up his land to make sure that there's a greater good which is being satisfied when we elites are not willing to do the same thing? So these are all difficult issues. I think we are following the democratic route. I think a lot of these issues are getting addressed. It will take a longer period of time. And China numbers, of course, there, but we should always say that, okay, compared to 10 years, have we actually made progress or not? The answer is yes. Compared to 20 years back, are we still lagging in certain areas? The answer is still yes. So therefore, you find out those pain points, have appropriate policies to the extent you're able to do it. I think this government has done a remarkable job in that particular manner. All the low-hanging fruits have been plucked. Wherever there's debate and discussion required, I think it follows the parliamentary processes. And I think that's the way democracy should be. So it's not just a case of saying that China has this and therefore I should do it. Just remember, the Chinese model was flawed. You had a model which brought about high growth because of too much of focus on infrastructure. You constructed great roads, those highways and all that, but you didn't have people to run it. You ran into a problem of consumption. So today the major problem of China is that you have very good infrastructure, you have the inequality which is there, people don't have money to spend. So we shouldn't fall into similar kind of traps. Keeping the broad numbers ready is fair enough, but we shouldn't get...
Thank you, Madan. Rajan, would you like to comment on that and tell us what your prognosis going down the road for us is, and how sustainable is, we're on the verge of reaching the $5 trillion economy golden mark. It may take 2 years, it may take 3 years, but we will be there, as everyone has concluded. But beyond that, going beyond the $5 trillion economy, what needs to be done? I think I'll give all three of you a chance to say a few words on what really needs to be done to perk up our economy and to ensure that we are well positioned not just for the $5 trillion economy, but the $10 trillion economy, and to expedite our reaching that golden point.
Yeah, I think that is best left to my colleagues, but I'd just like to trail off a little bit on the China comparison. It's a valid comparison because there was a period about 50 years back when, in terms of economy, GDP per capita, everything, we were roughly on par. China was able to put in place policies, growth-inducing policies, at least 15, 20 years before India could. And then they had the benefit of a very open trade environment, globally, which enabled them to put in place an export-oriented manufacturing model. Now, all those conditions have now changed for them as well as for the rest of the world. So while, yes, it's a legitimate comparison because at one point we were together, but today the paths are different. They've had the benefit of a very consistent, it's like having the same government for 50 years, which have a consistent, coordinated policy, which we can never have. So we have reached a certain position, which is not too bad, but you cannot really copy that model. We just hope that we overcome these difficulties over things like manufacturing, how to grow it and all. But yeah, now on the specifics,
Rajat.
So I'll very quickly say, there are multiple ingredients, and I'll try and lay out relating to what both Madan and Rajan has said. Now, when you compare from China, obviously you draw the best from what they've done, and Madan has, Rajan has just mentioned one of the things, the open sort of oriented manufacturing export-led model. A lot of people today say that openness is not going to happen because the world is becoming more protectionist. I sort of tend to not agree with that entirely, but yes, it is becoming more protectionist. Tariffs are at an all-time low. Tariffs have come down. The protectionism is coming more in terms of non-tariff barriers and standards, labor standards, competition, state-owned enterprises, and how you operate the economy, whether you're a market economy, all of that. So tariffs are at an all-time low, and I think we should take advantage of that. So the blueprint for us, I think, is, Madan made a point about private investment. So after 91, that takeoff that we saw, after liberalization, the takeoff that we saw, and then recently 2004 to 2009, I think that period, which we call the golden period of India's growth, where we averaged about 8.5%, 9% on average every year. That is called the golden period of India's growth. What was it driven by? It was driven by private investment and government support. Minimum government, maximum governance. So government basically changes its role from being a capital provider and investor to a government that, so this is aspirational, right? You're talking about $10 trillion economy. So government changes its role from, gets out of Air India, gets out of BSNL, gets out, all of that. So government provides the regulations, private investment comes in, it provides the infrastructure, market failure, where market failure happened, government gets it. So that's one of major roles, because private investment will be more productive, definitely, and more sort of employment generating, despite public sector being the employer of last resort and so on. That's not going to happen anymore. So that's one thing that we need to do. encourage private investment. The second thing is what I think Rajan said, continue to force openness on the rest of the world, and rather than shunning ourselves out of FTAs like RCEP, I don't know whether, like it or not, we have to engage with China economically. I'm not competent to talk about strategic and geostrategy. Economically, we have to engage with China. This China plus one, reshoring, friendshoring will happen at the margin. Believe me, our mobile phone industry will shut down tomorrow if we don't have imports from China. 70% of the components of your mobile phone are imported, and most of them come from China. It is a fact. We are exporting to the rest of the world, but the components are coming from China. So we have to be more open. That's what China did. They became open, moved up the value chain. You're not going to get design in India just like that, just because you have great computer scientists who are running multinational corporations outside the country. The environment in India also needs to be similar for them to come back and reproduce what they're doing there. So openness, private investment, get involved in global value chains and regional value chains, and push, again, I'd go back to push your manufacturing sector, including sort of your agriculture-related manufacturing, food processing, all of that, because we are the second largest producer of fruits and vegetables in the world. So we should exploit also the agricultural sector.
Madan, a few quick words from your side on the caveats, the refrains, and what we should be doing to ensure that we don't stumble after we reach the $5 trillion and that we sail through to the $10 trillion, because it does require a strong economic growth story. The larger the base, the more the effort.
Okay, I would tend to think that the government has done almost everything that should be done, and I think it's working in a proactive manner that whenever there's a problem, you have the right kind of policy response. So I wouldn't be actually burdening the government saying that they should be doing anything more. The initiative actually has to come from the private sector. And as what Rajat was mentioning, I think when we're talking about how do we get integrated with the global economy, being part of global value chains, I think that's what our PMFM have been talking of. That makes a lot of sense, because that is one thing which can actually give us a big push and make us more competitive. We should just remember one thing: there cannot be easy solutions to these kind of problems, because if you look at governments like say say Japan or even the USA, I think if it was so easy for governments to turn economies around in a very flippant manner, I would say there should be no problems anywhere, because all governments are trying to optimize their own growth level, create jobs, so on and so forth. So I think it's going to be a very, very slow process, and we'll have to be patient. But just one particular policy where I think we have not managed to do anything because of the political economy is on the agricultural side, because I think commercialization of agriculture is something which we should do. I thought that the farm laws which were introduced were superb laws which would have changed the complexion, but then you always have politics coming inside, and being a democracy, things have gotten held back, because still we say that I think the number is still right. 60% of our employment is still in agriculture. If we can make it more commercial, I think that can make a big deal. We could actually be suppliers to the world.
True. I think we are getting late for the next session. So I'm going to throw it open for, at best, 2 questions. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very engrossing session, discussion, and we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. There are many issues that need to be discussed. I would have discussed subjects like infrastructure, the quality of infrastructure, the way we are managing our infrastructure, managing our cities. Urban development looks very good, but there are lots of issues to be discussed there. Managing a state of liberal affairs in the economy. But that having all been said, I will surmise, as various economic magazines say, that this looks like something of the early stages of a bull run, and this is indeed India's moment. But before that, let's have those 2 quick questions. Anybody? Sir, you've already asked a lot of questions. Let me ask this gentleman here. Please give your name.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Myself Shamit Tiwari. See, जैसा कि सर आपने बोला था, less skilled, less educated. So I have a different story to tell. I belong to HR stream. So you just give advertisement in any of the media, you'll get lot of application, hell lot of application. So for me, it's less skilled and educated, because we need to do something about our education system. A lot of colleges are available. You name Qualification, you can get it easily.
We did talk about that, and that there is a dire need for it.
To
but
strengthen this, we
education
need
is a
to do
sector-
something about education systems.
So, you know, you can't take that advertisement and you're getting a lot of response for that and generalize for the rest of the...
Sir, I have an example to tell you, sir. I generally do hirings. Sir, talking about ITI candidates, diploma candidates, even MBAs. So they are quite qualified, but when it comes to interview, technical interview, they don't know much about. See, talking about lathe machine, everything, a lot of technical things. So they don't know.
So,
So it's up to the college. It is up to the college. It is the responsibility of college and education institute to inculcate all those things.
So, the population in urban India, I mean, is about 33%. Rural India is still dominant. So your responses maybe are coming from urban India, not from rural India. Maybe they are coming. But what I'm saying is that the abundant factor in India today, if you look at the Pratham reports, Asar reports, is that they are sort of, education enrollment has gone up. Certainly it has gone up. But as Raghav also said, and Rajan has also said, there's a skill mismatch in the labor market, which is what you're referring to. But there is also low-skilled people in the market who cannot be employed. So to employ those kind of, you can't wish them away, right? To employ those kind of people in hordes, you will, my contention is that you will need, I mean, of course they'll need to get some training, you'll need a sort of labor-intensive manufacturing. That's the point I'm making.
Namaskar, I am Shripad Kondle and I am apologize in advance for my raw type of question. There are how many zeros in 5 trillion? My first question. And really, these zeros have really zero effect on huge population who is poor in this country. Even if we become the 5 trillion economy, is it really going to affect the huge number of poor people in this country? Thank you, sir.
12 है साहब, 12 है उसमें.
The lady there.
और इससे गरीबों में कोई फर्क पड़ेगा सर?
वो तो डिस्कशन तो हो ही गई ना जनाब, वही तो कह रहे
The
थे
lady
हम.
there, please get up and announce your
Yeah.
name.
Hi, this is Oshin. Thanks for the session, sirs. It was very enlightening. One question I had, or rather a comment, and I would invite a comment from all of you, is that you spoke about low female labor force participation rate in India, right? And as compared to all the other competitors, the tiger economies. So should the government, in all its policies, also bring an element of gender so that we, especially with the socio-cultural fabric of India, kind of keeping women back? And also, is there a way that we, as we talk about increasing formalization, a lot of women's activities are at the border, right, in agriculture and allied activities that are not getting counted in GDP. So should we have, as economists, your comment on how can we count them in our GDP, in the formal GDP?
Okay. You know, this is a sort of very important question. So let me start by saying that, you know, there are reports and reports, Bank, OECD, etc., which suggest that if India had a balanced labor force participation rate, then our GDP would be 2.7 trillion, already higher than 2.7 trillion rupees, not dollar. I'm forgetting the exact number, but it would, you know, be growing 1.5% faster. So, and that's one of the shortfalls that Indian labor force participation rate for women has been lower. How do you get equal participation, or at least increase it from the abysmally low level? So one is policy support. Definitely, the government needs to do policy support, which it is doing. So there's reservation now, you know, there's a reservation in Parliament which will kick in, I think, in 29, in 24. No, in 29. It'll kick in 29. So that's a start. And there are reservations now in board positions. There are reservations for independent directors have to be women, etc. So reservation will not be the complete answer. It will have to be the market. But there's a whole social issue in the country that needs, and that's cultural change is a very slow process. And you know, I have friends who are sociologists in the university, who are multidisciplinary. So they keep saying that the social taboos, once income goes up, then the women are not allowed to go to work. Even if they're allowed to go to work, they are doing work which is not mediated through the market, which then doesn't even get counted. So there are multiple challenges, but I think reservation And there's a lot of stuff that is happening in urban areas, especially to empower women now. And the government is also encouraging women empowerment. But if we have equal number of women in the labor force, our sort of GDP will be higher. So my first impressions of visiting East Asia, and this was, I won't tell you the year, but it was decades ago. So visiting East Asia was every sort of women had just come. Krugman would say, or Solo says, how do you get growth? Well, on your right-hand side, you have capital, labor, and innovation. You put in more capital, you'll get more growth. You put in more labor, you'll get more growth. You have more productivity, which is the best form of growth, you'll get growth. Labor in East Asia, first it was all male. When they fell short of labor, women came into the labor force. And then if you visited, Vietnam and Cambodia, you will see, taxi operators, lift operators, front desk, receptionists, hotels, everywhere there was a point when you saw women. And then today, they've graduated into doing higher skilled jobs. We have, in urban areas, we seem to be going through that. Now you see women driving taxis, women as lift operators, as receptionists, etc. But it's not become as pervasive as it was in East Asia.
Just one point could I make here?
I think we have to... Madan, sorry, I missed that. Okay. Please go ahead, Madan.
Yeah, just a very quick point. If you look at the Indian manufacturing sector, for example, if you leave out admin and HR functions, we don't see women even opting for it. So today, if you carried out a survey of your IITs, for example, you are a qualified engineer, you would probably go into the BFSI sector, rarely do you go into manufacturing. And today, when we're talking of how manufacturing creates jobs, it tends to be more male-oriented. Women would also not like to go and work in factories. Or probably it's happening, but at a very, very slow pace.
But the law also is anti-women, anti-gender. The old law, which did not permit women to...
We've all come up with new laws, and we have a lot of Ladli Bahina and a lot of positive news for women. And I think, that's another discussion, another session for what impact it has on the budget and on the fiscal deficit and everything. But for the moment, it's good news. It's positive news. It's helping, as we saw, fill up the gender gap, and it's positive news. And on that very, very happy note, I want to end this session with a large thanks to Madan Sabnavis, the Chief Economist of the Bank of Baroda in Mumbai, Mr. Rajat Kathuria, who has been the chief economist for many, many institutions and is now a professor at Ashoka University, Shiv Nada University. Rajan Katoch Saab, who has been a senior IS officer, who has been secretary heavy industries, but he's been a bit of a chupa Rustam because he's very cleanly hid one of the reasons why at one time it looked like the ease of doing business was smoothened, because he also held the charge of the enforcement director, a much reviled institution today, but he held it with great aplomb and with great subtlety and decency. On that very, very happy note, we end this session. Thank you very much. Give them a large hand, please.
That was indeed a very informative and enlightening session. As much as we'd wanted to continue, we have time constraints.
Please come and give us the souvenir.
I'd like to request I'd like to request Devendra Mehta sir to please come forward and felicitate our panelists with a memento. The memento, ladies and gentlemen, is also the mascot of Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2024. It is a painting by senior most gone artist Ram Singh Urvati ji. It's a very beautiful motif which represents evolution of life. I'd also like to inform our audience that our next session is titled The Stories Behind Tiger Conservation, Gargi Rawat and Latika Nath in conversation with Deshdeep Saxena.